Russian leader Vladimir Putin continues to decry hard blows in succession. First of all, the mistake made by Belarus, known as an ally of Russia, led to the loss of thousands of Russian soldiers' lives. The Belarusian army has completely neutralized the Russian soldiers stationed on the Ukrainian border. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu's wife spoke very harshly to Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko. Shoigu's decrees may lead to the end of the alliance between Putin and Lukashenko. While such a crisis decayed between Belarus and Russia, the blowing up of the Russian Navy ship anchored 160 kilometers away in the Straits of Turkey was another blow to Putin. The Russian Navy blowing up inside the Turkish sea borders has driven Vladimir Putin crazy. Turkish President Erdogan, known as a close friend of Putin, is having a very difficult time, as it is known. While the war between Russia and Ukraine was continuing, the course of the war changed greatly and the war suddenly decamped to the borders of Russia. Wagner mercenary company. Yevgeny Prigozhin's attempt to stage a coup in Russia led to the war on Ukrainian soil, reaching a very different dimension. Although Prigozhin gave up on the coup he wanted to carry out in Russia, the consequences of this coup attempt were very severe for Russia. Thousands of Russian soldiers who fought for Vladimir Putin on the territory of Ukraine have completely lost their trust in Putin. The patience of Russian soldiers who have been fighting on Ukrainian territory since the beginning of the war has run out. For this reason, during Prigozhin's coup attempt, thousands of Russian soldiers left the army and wanted to join the Wagner soldiers. However, when Prigozhin withdrew Wagner troops from the cities of Rostov and Voronezh, the Russian soldiers who left the army were left alone. Thousands of Russian troops, unwilling to continue the war on Ukrainian territory any longer, wanted to leave Ukraine through the borders of Belarus. But these Russian soldiers who wanted to leave Ukraine were attacked by Belarusian border guard soldiers. Thousands of Russian soldiers who remained in the firing line of Belarusian soldiers were surprised at what they suffered. As for the details of the news, for a long time, Russian soldiers deployed to the towns of Horodnia and Snovsk towns near the Ukrainian border with Belarus wanted to flee Ukraine, unable to stand the unfavorable conditions created by the war any longer. However, according to the new law issued by Vladimir Putin, Russian soldiers who tried to flee the war or refused to fight would be decried with prison sentences of between 5 and 10 years. Thus, Russian soldiers realized that they could not return to Russia if they fled the war. The vast majority of Russian soldiers who are living almost a prison life in Ukraine are either surrendering to the Ukrainian army or trying to save their lives by applying for asylum in neighboring countries of Ukraine. But for the first time, a large number of Russian soldiers tried to leave Ukrainian territory through the borders of Belarus. But this effort of the Russian soldiers was blocked by the Belarusian army. The Belarusian army not only prevented the escape of Russian soldiers, but also led to the serious injury of hundreds of Russian soldiers. Russian soldiers who set out from the Russian headquarters, established in the cities of Horodnia and Snovsk, disobeyed the orders of their unit commanders and started a riot inside the headquarters. Realizing that they would be arrested for this rebellion they had caused, the Russian soldiers left the headquarters on the same day and headed for the Belarusian border. The fugitive Russian soldiers who thought that they could enter the borders of Belarus because Belarus and Russia were allies were quite wrong about this. Russian soldiers who managed to get as close as the city of Novaya Gudar, located on the Belarusian border with Ukraine, were stopped by Belarusian border guards before they could set foot on Belarusian territory. Thousands of Russian soldiers were subjected to attacks by Belarusian soldiers. According to information obtained from regional sources, a large number of Russian soldiers were killed in this attack by the Belarusian army, while hundreds of Russian soldiers were seriously injured. At the same time, a large part of the Russian soldiers who survived and tried to cross the Belarusian border had to turn back. Despite the fact that Russia and Belarus are allies, the fact that the Belarusian army carried out such an attack on Russian soldiers shocked the whole world. But the real face of the business was revealed later. The Belarusian commander who gave the order to fire at the Russian soldiers did not know that these soldiers approaching the border were Russian soldiers. The Belarusian commander, aware that the course of the war in Ukraine had turned in favor of Ukraine after the coup, events in Russia, thought that these soldiers approaching the Belarusian border were Ukrainian soldiers. The Russian soldiers had disguised themselves as civilians by removing the military uniforms they had worn to escape from Ukrainian territory. For this reason, the Belarusian commander was completely unaware that these soldiers belonged to the Russian army. However, the weapons found in the hands of the soldiers were a sufficient reason for the Belarusian commander to order an attack. The first reaction to this incident on the border between Ukraine and Belarus came from Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. Russian Minister Sergei Shoigu has almost lashed out at Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko for his statement. Shoigu, who targeted President Lukashenko, said that such a mistake cannot be forgiven and that Belarus is responsible for the loss of hundreds of Russian soldiers' lives. Shoigu decried the need to suspend the alliance agreement between Russia and Belarus and stated that he would meet with Vladimir Putin privately about this issue. As it is known, a large number of Russian soldiers, weapons and ammunition were taken to the territory of Belarus by Vladimir Putin. These Russian soldiers are training Belarus soldiers. Shoigu, on the other hand, stated that they would withdraw the Russian soldiers sent to the territory of Belarus. Shoigu not only withdrew these soldiers, but also demanded the return of all military equipment sent to Belarus in recent months. Another of Shoigu's special requests is that the Belarusian troop commander who gave the order to shoot at Russian soldiers be transferred to Russia and tried in Russian courts. Minister Shoigu decried such a mistake as inexcusable and demanded that the commander who ordered the attack be tried by Russian courts, so that ties between Belarus and Russia are not completely severed. This tension between Shoigu and Lukashenko led to the emergence of claims that the alliance between Vladimir Putin and Lukashenko has come to an end. Decapitation between Shoigu and Lukashenko. It is not possible for Defense Minister Shoigu to make such statements on his own. Many expert investigators say that Putin is also aware of Shoigu's statements and that Shoigu is only being used as an intermediary. If these claims are true, this mistake of the Belarusian army may have led to the complete decoupling of the alliance between Russia and Belarus. However, while such a big crisis was taking place between Russia and Belarus, the blowing up of a Russian Navy ship within the maritime borders of Turkey, which decried a neutral policy in the war, shocked the whole world. The Russian Navy ship that was blown up 160 kilometers from the Turkish Straits off the Black Sea managed to enter the whole world agenda. But there was only one question on everyone's mind: what was the Russian Navy ship doing inside the Turkish maritime borders? And why did Turkey destroy a Russian Navy ship? Before we get to the details of the news, let's tell you for what purpose. The Russian Navy ship that was blown up was trying to dock in the Straits of Turkey. As it is known, due to the fact that Turkey is a NATO member state, the US government was constantly sending Navy ships to the Turkish Straits. As it is known, according to the Straits Agreement signed by Turkey, it is forbidden for any Navy ship to pass through the Straits. However, the US government frequently sends US Navy ships to the Straits of Turkey and has them dock there in order to intimidate Russia. The purpose of the US doing this is to threaten Russia's dominance over the Black Sea. As it is known, Russian leader Vladimir Putin wants to take the Black Sea completely under his control by sending a large number of Navy ships to the Crimean port of Sevastopol. Putin, who wants to prevent the Ukrainian army or any of Ukraine's allies from carrying out attacks through the sea, is keeping these Navy ships in the port of Sevastopol. However, the fact that the United States constantly sends Navy ships to the Turkish Straits has made Putin very uncomfortable. Putin, who wants to respond to these threatening actions of the United States, has decided to send the Russian Navy to the Turkish Straits in order to show that he is on good terms with her. Dorgan, who has been re-elected president in Turkey. Only one Russian navy operating from the port of Sevastopol entered Turkey's Black Sea maritime borders and from there began to move towards the Turkish Straits. However, the Russian Navy ship encountered an attack that they never expected. Surprised by what they had suffered, the Russian crew was attacked at a distance of 160 kilometers from the Turkish Straits. It was a different Navy ship that organized this attack on the Russian Navy. With this attack, the Russian Navy ship received very heavy damage and had to return to the port of Sevastopol. Shortly, with this interesting event, the eyes of the whole world were turned to Turkey. Everyone thought that this attack was carried out by Turkey, but the event was much different, as it is known. Towards the middle of the war, Turkey produced 3 different Navy ships for Ukraine. Thus, 3 different Navy ships anchored in Black Sea waters of Ukraine were being kept ready. The Ukrainian government did not want to remove these Navy ships from the Turkish borders because he was aware that if he took it out, Russia would launch an attack on these Navy ships. For this reason, the Ukrainian crew had been living inside these Navy ships for months. However, when it was learned that the Russian Navy ship had entered the Turkish maritime borders, the Ukrainian Navy ships took action and the Russian Navy ship was attacked off the Black Sea without entering the Straits. The Ukrainian Navy ships were only engaged in harassment fire, but the Russian ship was heavily damaged after one of the artillery shots hit the Russian Navy ship. The Russian crew, on the other hand, decided to return to the Crimea and sea borders with a sudden change of plan. At the first moment when the attack took place, Vladimir Putin thought that this attack was carried out by Turkey. However, this short-term tension between Erdogan and Putin ended when Turkish government officials deciphered the truth of the matter as the war between Russia and Ukraine continues across the border. The war has started to be felt intensively on Ukrainian territory again. After the coup attempts in Russia, the Russian army in Ukraine has also lost power. The Ukrainian army, which wants to turn this situation into an opportunity, began to organize air operations against the Russian forces without wasting any time. The Ukrainian army managed to destroy 2 T-72 model tanks in the Zaporizhia region with the HIMARS missile systems it procured from the United States. A large number of Russian soldiers were also killed in this air operation against the Russian headquarters in the town of Huliaopol, one of the border towns of Zaporizhia. According to information obtained from regional sources, more than 200 Russian soldiers lost their lives in science with this air operation. On the other hand, hot clashes continue in the Donetsk region, which is under Russian occupation. The Ukrainian army, which has been conducting ground operations against the Donetsk region, which has been under the control of the Russian army for a long time, managed to destroy the Russian T-90 model tank, which Vladimir Putin calls a war machine. Ukrainian border guards came into conflict with a Russian contingent that confronted them as they continued to advance in the Donetsk region. Russian soldiers were forced to withdraw after hours of clashes, leaving a small area to the Ukrainian army. However, as the Russian soldiers retreated, a soldier from the Ukrainian army managed to destroy the Russian T-90 tank with a portable anti-tank. The Ukrainian army has recently significantly increased its ground operations. But on the other hand, the Ukrainian Air Force is also giving the Russian forces a very difficult time. 2 Ukrainian Su-25 fighter jets are supporting the offensive launched by Ukrainian soldiers in the south of the country. Ukrainian hero pilots do not open eyes to the Russian army by providing flights at very low altitudes. Ukrainian pilots carrying out air strikes on Russian forces stationed in the region are supporting Ukrainian soldiers trying to advance from the ground. Another interesting incident that occurred in the same region is the 92nd Ukrainian Armed Forces. It happened that the brigade soldiers destroyed one of Russia's armored delivery trucks. Russian soldiers who had to withdraw from the region were using this armored truck while smuggling weapons and ammunition inside the headquarters. However, 92 The kamikaze unmanned combat aircraft operators of the brigade unit managed to destroy the armored truck that the Russian soldiers were trying to hijack by activating 3 unmanned combat aircraft. According to the information obtained, the name of this armored truck is said to be Ural. This success of the Ukrainian unmanned combat aircraft operators brought a big noise. Hot developments continue to take place in the Chervona-Popevka region, which has been under the control of the Russian military for a long time. The Russian army, while trying to continue its advance in this region, encountered a major obstacle in front of them. Ukrainian soldiers who have been using unmanned combat aircraft quite successfully since the beginning of the war managed to stop Russian soldiers attacking in the Chervona-Popevka region with UFC. Ukrainian soldiers who carried out terror operations against Russian soldiers with unmanned combat aircraft managed to stop the advance of Russian forces here. The Ukrainian army is really quite successful in unmanned combat aircraft and drones. The armed forces of Ukraine 72. The soldiers of the brigade are implementing a mind-boggling strategy. Ukrainian soldiers who destroyed mines planted by Russian soldiers with drones are appreciated by their commanders. It has been announced by the Ukrainian government that 28 Russian tanks have been destroyed on Ukrainian territory in the last month alone. According to information obtained from Telegram channels used by the Ukrainian army, 6 Russian tanks have been destroyed in the last 2 days. One of these tanks was destroyed by an anti-tank missile known as Stugnepi, which is frequently used by the Ukrainian army. The number of tanks that Vladimir Putin has sent to the territory of Ukraine has decreased significantly. Russian officials who say that the Russian army inventory has been reduced by half are quite complaining about this situation because shortly after this incident, Ukrainian soldiers destroyed another Russian tank using 5 kamikaze drones. The fact that the Russian army has lost so many tanks also affects the Russian economy quite badly. We can understand that the Ukrainian army has made a change of strategy with its recent operations. This blow to Vladimir Putin, which was struck by another operation organized by the Ukrainian army, caused a great panic in the Kremlin palace. As a result, Ukraine made the most dramatic measure when the footsteps of the coup resonated in Russia. Ukraine proceeded to take advantage of every opportunity available to it. Ukrainian forces' attacks have resulted in a massive victory against the Russian army in Bakhmut, and we will keep you updated on the latest developments in this matter. The Ukrainian army began to adopt diverse actions in the last days of the Russian-Ukrainian war in order to cause greater problems for the Russian army. The Ukrainian army began to attack important locations. Although this scenario began through Russia's ammunition channels, the Ukrainian army, which is becoming stronger by the day, has made the move to destroy the Russians, and the Russian army at Bakhmut was in complete disarray. The Ukrainian army began by devising strategies for driving the Russians back because the Russian army's failure in bloody fighting meant nothing. The Russian army was continually mobilizing and taking several moves. In other words, the Russian army has reached a point where there will be no lack of personnel. As a result, the Ukrainian army was able to strike more important targets. The Ukrainian army has begun to take extremely varied methods in order to disturb the comfort of Russian soldiers who are suffering from issues within the army. Problems such as low morale caused by recurrent failures and the inability to satisfy even basic demands have risen dramatically in recent years. The Ukrainian army has given a significant blow to the Russians as a result of the construction of the environment. Prigozhin's planning formed the foundation of this coup. Putin instantly commanded that the entire army return to Moscow when Prigozhin lifted his head to him. This has resulted in an even more appropriate setting. The Ukrainian army has established an intelligence unit whose primary mission is to identify the most vital Russian structures in this region. These warriors would be capable of ensuring Ukraine's success while also understanding the Russians' intelligence difficulties at this moment. Ukrainian intelligence was confronted with a totally different development, and he recognized where the true blow would be delivered to the Russian troops. The Ukrainian army may have made the Russian soldiers at Bakhmut, who were already in difficulties, considerably more so. And the Ukrainian army reacted promptly. And he's used every resource at his disposal to plan his most difficult operation ever. Preparations for the spring operation have already begun. The Ukrainian army was on the verge of a major triumph over the Russians. The Ukrainian army, believing that the power plant that supplies energy to Russians is covered by air defense systems, sent unmanned aerial vehicles to test it. The Ukrainian army has now reached the stage where it will take that vital move as a consequence of the detections made by these unmanned aerial vehicles. Putin observed the Russian military removing its air defense equipment from this location. Putin has directed the delivery of the final air defense systems to these operations side. Bakhmut was hence ideal for aerial bombardment, and the Ukrainian army started preparations after that. The Ukrainian army had moved unmanned aerial vehicles and weapons within striking distance of Bakhmut. The Russian army was progressively leaving this area. The Ukrainian army, on the other hand, has made steps to capitalize on the situation. The Ukrainian army, which will compel Russia to withdraw from this territory, has evacuated the unmanned aerial vehicles. And he arrived above the Russian bombardment. The Ukrainian army inflicted extensive damage by repeatedly shelling the location where power is stored and generated. Even while the Russian forces wanted to respond, they were unable to do so. A red notice was also issued to evacuate the dam. Following that, the Ukrainian army used a diversionary maneuver to withdraw the unmanned aerial vehicles, and it caused the Russian army to consider the withdrawal to be the end of the operation. At this very time, the Ukrainian army revealed their secret weapon while the Storm Shadows from the UK and the HIMARS from the US were in close proximity. They began to be launched towards the Russian troops. The Ukrainian army received no reaction to the Russian troops dispatched to this region. However, due to the Ukrainian army firing at the coordinates and inflicting significant damage to the dam, all neighboring offices lost power. This scenario has created significant disruption inside the Russian army. Russian soldiers who had begun to flee their headquarters in fear began to wait where they were, as a consequence of radio signals from the Kremlin. But Ukraine has a very different strategy for this circumstance. The Ukrainian army, aware that Russian soldiers are uneasy due to the difficulties they are facing, has taken a significant move against the Russians, and the framework has been laid for the Russian army to face its most difficult challenge yet. The Ukrainian army's new move has demonstrated that Russia is unable to offer protection, even in territory it has already captured. The Russians were perplexed as to what to do against the Ukrainian army in this circumstance. Following these big developments, the Ukrainian army gathered all of its resources to plan additional significant operations in Bakhmut. But at this moment, the Russian army, which was having problems with the computerized database, was powerless to prevent soldiers from fleeing when the Russian army men retreated. Ukraine took advantage of the situation and he shared the "I want to live" phone number he had set up only for them. Russian troops began to revolt, one after the other, indicating that they did not wish to fight in Putin's army in light of a wealth of material disclosed as a consequence of seized Russian troops. Statements. Russian soldiers who have demonstrated that even basic requirements are not being satisfied have begun to desire to oppose Putin. This circumstance has allowed several factions to join Ukraine's ranks in a succession, and as the Ukrainian army's power grows, Russian soldiers who had to fight alongside their compatriots began to think about certain things. At this point, war analysts' statements regarding Putin's mismanagement and dissent among Russian soldiers will astound the whole globe. Prigozhin, on the other hand, has opened the most critical sector for Ukraine to win the war. And now that the Russian people are revolting, Putin is fully surrounded. With the departure of the Wagner forces from Russian soil, important events in Russia started. Protesters' flames encircling the Kremlin have reached meters in height. The Russian people's tolerance has now run out. Millions of Russian residents have begun rallies around the country, including surrounding the Kremlin. Putin's greatest fear has come true. He has demonstrated his totalitarian mentality to the whole globe. Russian civilians coming to the streets are demanding that Putin halt the war, not that it be made necessary. The instigators of the disturbances set fire to automobiles and stores in the Kremlin area one by one. The entire world is buzzing about Russia's riots. These uprisings, which generate massive flames, are unavoidable. The Kremlin on the other side has made an unprecedented measure in Russian history to quiet down the protesters and rioters. The Russian people who organized the rally were overjoyed with the Kremlin's public declaration. The fires and explosions near the Kremlin have made Kremlin officials quite worried. With a decision made by Putin in recent weeks, every Russian citizen rushed to the streets to protest. All residents gathered around the Kremlin after hearing Putin's decision, and enormous demonstrations ensued. Many automobiles and stores on the streets near the Kremlin were robbed and destroyed. People have flocked to the streets in protest of Putin's authoritarian and harsh policies, demanding that he stop Russian citizens attempting to make their views heard to the Kremlin have used large flames to do so. Vladimir Putin, who gained notoriety as a leader who cares about nothing, is currently surrounded the biggest dread of the world's leaders who have been mirrored in history and are demonstrating authoritarian views that are still felt now is their own people. The reason for this is that nothing is more powerful than the word of the people in the country. Putin's demonstration of authoritarian views at the start of the conflict sparked widespread outrage throughout the world. Putin, who succeeded to seize control of all Russian institutions, proceeded to fool his own people with fake news on a daily basis. This mindset is extremely difficult for tyrannical dictators to portray. A leader who wishes to aggressively demonstrate this mentality should be in the hands of the country's media and legal institutions, because the public always believes news and judgments based on these two principles. If a dictatorial leader retains these two ideals and directs them in the way he desires, he may also have the people in his hands and make things happen. But Putin's recent move has made all Russians realize one by one what is wrong and a lie. Putin has nowhere to hide now that the Russian people have realized this. Putin, on the other side, is attempting to entirely exonerate himself by repeatedly disseminating fake news with the institutions he owns after the events. Many Russian media channels are full of misinformation. The Russian army, which is known to have won several operations, is today unable to stand even against Ukrainian soldiers on the battlefield. Images and videos uploaded by the Ukrainian army on social media platforms disprove these broadcasting institutions, which spread fake news that is pro-Putin and full of lies. Although the Russian public are fully aware of the army's status, the real Russian army is in serious difficulties behind the falsehoods. Recently, the Russian people have begun to comprehend the true reality by exposing one by one the falsehoods and games that have been going on within the country. When the public learned about these games, they flocked to the streets to make their opinions known, and demonstrations erupted across the country. The public hold Putin accountable for the country's enormous economic catastrophe. Russia appears that Putin, who has made several mistakes in dealing with the Ukrainian conflict and internal difficulties, will not be able to avoid the power of the people this time. Putin, who has generated so many problems in his country in accordance with his own selfish desires, has begun to fear his own people. The Russian army, which has suffered significant setbacks on numerous fronts of the conflict, has begun to face significant challenges. The Russian army, which is losing men on a daily basis, is unable to reach a sufficient number of soldiers to maintain its occupation. The Russian army, which is short on men, is unable to deliver firearms to its soldiers on duty. The Russian army, which has been unable to invest in the military sector in any form, has begun to experience the full impact of the economic crisis. Russia, which has lost its main sources of money as a result of actions conducted by Ukrainian troops, is attempting to maintain the economic crisis at its most severe state. Citizens within the country, on the other hand, have begun to struggle to fulfill even their most basic necessities. People in Russia have had enough of the terrible circumstances and are flocking to the streets to conduct anti-war and anti-Putin rallies. Citizens from many cities have gathered around the Kremlin to try to make their opinions heard. Putin's resignation shouts ring throughout the Kremlin, where over 100,000 citizens have assembled. The Russians, who sought to make their voices known, received no responses from the Kremlin, and things became quite confusing at this point. Russian individuals who wanted to be heard chose to use violence to make their opinions known. People in Russia who did not thoroughly lubricate the automobiles and businesses near the Kremlin set fire to the spots they did not lubricate, resulting in major fires. The enormous flames that erupted surrounding the Kremlin could not be put out in any way. The protesters, who had also begun to block fire personnel from reaching the fires, neutralized the fire teams and used hoses to douse Russian soldiers within the Kremlin. Many initiatives on social media platforms have been created by those who wish to make their voices heard to the Kremlin. The Russian people, who had gathered a large number of signatures during the campaign, delivered these signatures to the Kremlin palace and waited for a response. Officials in the Kremlin, on the other hand, were anxious as a result of the commotion outside. After reviewing the signatures presented to Kremlin, the authorities agreed to meet with the demonstrators in front of the Kremlin palace. This speech, on the other hand, reverberated throughout the world and officially drove Putin insane. The Kremlin officially drove Putin insane in the address, indicating that the people's desire to depose Putin would be assessed. Putin's worst dread was realized after this speech, which shocked Russian President Vladimir Putin. People are the most powerful material in a country within the country. There is nothing that people cannot do or tolerate. The people who have the right to select and be elected can force the country's head leader to call early elections and remove him from office if they so want. Putin, who is attempting to portray lies and falsehoods in the eyes of the entire country, is now able to do this. Many Russian residents claim they no longer wish to live on Russian land. People who believe that Russia led a very wonderful existence before the war began state that the deconfliction of the war caused them significant grief in unbiased public interviews. Russian citizens who do not want to be exposed to Putin's harsh and authoritarian views have sought for visas to a number of Western nations. The Russian people are absolutely fed up with Putin, who claims that the conflict should be terminated immediately in Russia, which is in the midst of several difficulties. Putin is at a loss for what to do in the face of intense public criticism. Putin's carpet was on the international agenda since he is known for not being frightened of anything. The advancement of Ukrainian forces in the field of battle has also begun to generate significant issues for Putin. Ukrainian forces who are making the greatest use of incoming supplies are crushing Russian forces at a number of key positions.